Hi everyone, it's Keisha Henry coming to you live on Saturday, August 15th. I should remember what today is. Today's my anniversary, 22 years. And so coming to you live today on August 15th. I almost said October, we're not there yet. And I'm excited because this is week number 6. And my goodness, can you believe it? You know, I promised to do a 7-week series and we're almost there. And I could not have done it without you. When I think about the work that we've done together in the last 6 weeks. And I must say, I do see the downloads that are taking place. That lets me know that, globally speaking, we are having this conversation for a reason. It means that we're connecting on important topics in our lives. And today is no different then. And, we're talking about healing through a cultural lens. And there's so much I can say about lens. In fact, I'll just say it now. When I think about lens, what comes to mind for me from a cultural perspective? And again, if you've read anything about me, you know I'm from the Caribbean, you know I'm from Jamaica. And so when I think about cultural lens, what am I looking through? What comes to mind, like a picture, like an imagination for me? I imagine like a sieve. In Jamaica, we call that a strainer, It's like this big whole round thing with a wiring, like a mesh and a handle. And we put the different things through it to extract those meaningful parts or those things that we need for it to come through that's going to be beneficial to us. And so that's what I think about when I think about cultural lens. So if that word lens is throwing you off, then metaphorically, from your cultural perspective, replace it with something metaphoric that you can relate to. Because I really want you to relate to what I'm talking about. Always. And this is not a lecture. I say this all the time. This is us, and I've always said, I really envision us all around the world sitting together like around a bonfire. And we're talking, really. Like, I said, Lord, I really want to do something like that. I want to, talk to women and girls, like in this one big circle. And, internet has its, perspectives, right? Social media has its perspective. But I think it has good qualities, too. Because in moments like this, I think about, people are able to download Healing Up the Heart podcast, and they're able to relate to what I'm talking about. And I would love to get the other side of that. I would like to talk to those persons who are downloading and those persons who are relating to what I'm talking about. Like, I just see myself talking to you. I love that. I absolutely love that. And so today is no different, and we're going to do that with this topic on healing. So I admit, healing is a large topic, like it's so many nuances in this topic of healing. And before I go any further, hold on, check my time. Before I go any further, I want to dedicate this episode to someone that I worked with a few years ago. This person's name is Cowboy, pseudonym name Cowboy. Obviously, I can't give real names. But Cowboy just released an album, and I received a copy. And I also received a note with the copy of the album. And I was floored. I was blown away by it. I was very tearful, actually. My husband saw me. My daughter saw me. Because, I asked the question to my family, what do I do with something like this? For someone to take the time to write and to share their gratitude for their own healing and for the work that we've done together. Because, I always say, really, you privilege me. And so really, although you're saying, I've helped you, my God, you really have had to allow me to do that. And so really, it's not about me, but it's about you. So this episode is dedicated to Cowboy. I want to tell you that I appreciate you. And I appreciate you taking the time to send that to me and to the words that you've penned to that paper. It goes a long way. And I appreciate you. And I think it's very fitting that I give this tribute in this episode to you as we talk about healing through a cultural lens. So, with that said, let's continue then. So healing, right? And I have my notes, because remember the last time I shared that, sometimes when I go back and I listen to the sessions, I'm like, I didn't cover everything. So I actually have my notes to make sure I cover what I need to cover. And remember, this is not a lecture style, this is us talking. When I think about healing through a cultural lens, and I think about persons who are listening, or anyone who will listen, beyond the audience that I know now or have come to know and I'm learning, this needs to be an approachable topic. This needs to be something that someone can say, Matter of fact, honestly, do we even pause to even consider that word healing? I know for some people that I've worked with, healing conjures up a lot of different meanings based on their own life experiences. And, life experiences are very, very legit, right? It is very important and cannot be underscored enough. So with that said, I want to begin with this understanding then, that, we all experience adversities, we experience hardships and difficulties. And as a result of that, it drives us towards healing. I mean, if you get a cut, okay, you're not going to sit there and let this wound just continue opened and to be open and not to be taken care of. You're going to do something about it. Because if you don't take care of it, obviously, there's going to be infection and, you won't be able to function normally. So that's the physical aspect of a wound. But then what we go through in life, cause us to have emotional and psychological wounds, okay? And so based on that, then, we're going to talk about these psychological and emotional wounds. We're going to explore that through culture, explore that through family, through community, and spirituality, which you often hear me talk about, because that's a big part of my identity, and of course identity and personal meaning, to explore how these can shape, what healing looks like for each of us. I really want you to consider that. I want you to consider that. So healing is universal, meaning that we all we drive towards healing because of the things that we experience. But oftentimes, you and I both know, and you can sense the direction that I'm going in, that healing will often look different for all of us. So across cultures, across the world, I'm looking at my notes, we experience everything that I've talked about. And, perhaps some of us experience, different types of losses, whether it's a grief loss, the death of a loved one, a spouse, a child, and those are different types of grief, right? The loss of a spouse versus the loss of a child, that's two different types of grief. And I have experienced that in the work that I do. That's tough. I've lost a parent, so I know what it's like to having, that loss. But what may be universal is the human need to heal. But what we may differ in is our language. Again, I'm thinking about persons listening to the episodes, right? I know I don't speak. Thank God for closed caption, translation. You can hear or understand what I'm talking about. But healing then is different in language, the way how we go about healing, the pathway then basically, the timeline, and because in some cultures, you got to get over that thing real quick, 6 months or a year even. Who knows? This may vary from culture to culture, and so oftentimes, some people, from a cultural perspective, then healing has a timeline for some people. And in North America, we say when in a DSM-4 and a DSM-5, I'm not sure now what DSM-5 says, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual says that, if healing is not, if there's no movement with your grief over a period of time, it says to be, complex grief, right? Complex grief or complicated grief, right? And I look back on those terminologies and I'm like, who gets to define that? Who gets to define that? And there's a lot of, other pathology that's included. I get that. And, and different layers. So I don't want to get lost and get off track. But the point I'm making is, trauma and grief, all of those adversities that I'm mentioning, it drives us to this path of healing. So healing is a restoration. So let's look at ways to define healing. I don't know, I'm going to mention them and to see if any, strikes you. Because really, I want you to personalize. Maybe you can think about, what loss that you have sustained in your life. Maybe you're having a loss right now. Maybe you have a kid that went off to college. That's a loss. I mean, I remember when my son went to didn't want to go to college, and he went to go work for at 18 he went to work for AT&T, and he went to Jacksonville. That was tough. You know how I had to reframe that? I had to reframe that as he went to college, and even that was tough. So early I talked about how sometimes you're going through a change in life, a transition point, and that can be a sense of loss. I know I experienced that. So let's look at then maybe universal ways to define healing. Healing as a restoration or a movement towards wholeness, right? So a movement towards wholeness. So a movement towards wholeness, I just want to make sure I clarify this point, that it's not necessarily returning to who you were before. And as a matter of fact, this makes me want to tell you about our final topic next week, which is on resilience. So oftentimes when we're on this path to healing, I want to normalize for anyone listening that it does not necessarily mean that you return to who you were before, because oftentimes we are changed, and we are changed forever, based on that thing that we experience. So that's one aspect of healing. Another aspect of healing is perhaps involving, as I mentioned, the physical, the emotional, the relational, the social, and sometimes even spiritual. That's a whole lot. So we talk about the physicality of healing. We talk about the emotional, psychological side of healing, the spiritual side of healing, the relational. And let's be clear, we know that relationships make up our existence. Persons who live in isolation, we know the outcome. The outcomes from persons who are isolated. In fact, research shows that persons who are isolated, their lifespan is very short, right? Because there's no communication, there's no interdependence, there isn't any collaboration, there isn't anyone touching that person's right brain to right brain healing, if you want to call it that. Okay, so the first aspect, we look at the physicality or the biophysical aspects of healing. So we're just trying to define healing, right? So healing isn't just one thing then. You notice? It's not just one thing. It's the mind, it's the body. It's all integrated. It's not just one aspect. And healing sometimes, I'm going to put myself in this one, healing sometimes can be an ongoing process of change. So what does that mean? It means that, it's not a one-time deal. How could it be? Remember, we talked about, life, the cornerstone of life is adversity, and what else? Existentialism. Existential, things that exist outside our control. And let's admit, a lot of things exist outside our control. I'm going to tell you, I struggle with that sometimes from a spiritual perspective. Because, if you're from a creationist perspective, we experience things, and do you ask the question? I say, well, God, if you love me and you care about me, why do you allow this thing to happen? Why? If you say to have faith, and to have faith in you about this thing or that thing, and I believed you for it, and it did not happen, and of course that caused me some emotional and psychological discomfort, pain, which also brings about that change, then how is it you care about me, right? So we're asking, questions. Some people ask the question. I remember working with an individual and lost a child, and the question was, and this individual was a Christian as well, if God loved me, I've been trying to conceive for a while, why would God allow me to experience that, right? So experiencing pain will drive us in this direction of healing and to try to find meaning. And for some of us, it's a process of change. We're being processed over time, and it's a movement towards healing rather than like one single time of seeking healing. So healing is not a sprint. Basically, it's not a sprint. It's not like I'm going to cross the finish line and this is going to be it for this thing or that thing. Right? Now, and here's the last point I want to make about universal ways of defining healing. By the way, let me just pause here. Did you catch yourself in any of that? Right? Yeah, maybe. So, this last piece, meaning making. Because, I often share with my clients, I say, I'm asked, why this and why that? And I'll say point blank, I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer for you. And I'll say things like, I don't know that anyone else will have an answer for you. And there's times when I ask my clients, I say, if you had an answer, but it didn't change the outcome, would it matter? Would it matter? And, some of the responses I get really blow my mind. I remember one reflection point, someone said, maybe I'll hurt less. Maybe the pain will be decreased or lessened, but I'll still hurt because that outcome did not change. But I'll have an answer. So I always make this argument. I'll make a suggestion. So in the moment then, since you're not able to get an answer, maybe we can probably looking at the meaning of some of this and begin to unpack perhaps what this means, what this may mean in the face of not having an answer. So some of the questions, I continue to ask in moments where, as we're defining healing, because remember, everyone defines healing differently, and I listed a few because clearly, I can tell you many stories of how persons that privilege me, their perspective on healing. Oh my gosh, it's vast, right? And although I hear some similarities, they're presented differently, and that's the unique part about it. So when we're looking at defining healing, some people ask meaning-making questions like, how do I stop hurting? As I mentioned before, someone said, hey, if I had an answer, maybe I would hurt less. Maybe. Not even, there's no guarantee because we don't know. Maybe. And meaning-making questions then, I continue to ask individuals who perhaps are stuck on, why is it I don't have an answer? I ask, perhaps, what does this mean to not have an answer? Who are you now that you don't have an answer? And perhaps, how do you and I live moving forward? Let me repeat those questions because I have them written. So how do I stop hurting? What does this mean for you now? Who am I now, and how do I live from here? Let's just pause there because those are really significant questions. And again, I don't know where you are in the world. I'm not even sure if you're allowed to ask those questions depending on your cultural or your civ. Are you allowed to ask those questions? And this is the thing about culture. What does your culture allow you to do? What does it allow you to do? Does your culture work for you? Or do you work for your culture? Let me ask it again. Does your culture work for you? Or do you work for your culture? Because if it works for you, you should be able to, I'm hoping, find some relief, find some meaning making out of your healing process. Because we understand already universally that, we all look towards healing. Trauma and different, adversities will drive us towards healing. So does your culture work for you, or do you work for your culture? Right? So is it working for you? Meaning, is it helping you? Is it helping you to define healing? Is it helping you to process healing? Is it helping you to move towards healing? Right? So let's just think about that. I'm going to turn my notes here. I'm thinking about, usually I play some music right about now, but I'm on my phone recording and I don't have all of that set up. So I'm going to continue. So there's a distinction between healing, cure, and recovery. And I'm going to give some examples. Matter of fact, I want to give some examples too when we talk about, different stories to bring, to make an example when we're talking about identifying what healing is through your culture. And this is a time where I wish I had other people to talk to me. Maybe in this session, you can drop me a line in the comment section. What is one cultural point, sticking point, that works for you, right? What is one cultural sticking point that works for you? And by culture, I mean your way of life, your way of living, the traditions. Is it family? Is it through community? Is it through your spiritual practice or spiritual community? So what aspect of your culture is helping you towards healing? And again, is your culture working for you? Or are you working for your culture? If you're working for your culture, it means then that you're burdened. You are not helped. You're not moving forward with healing, but you're burdened, and you continue to be saddled with that hurt, with that pain, and you continue to hold it in. Which brings me to this next point. So let's distinguish between healing, cure, and recovery. So a person can be medically cured and still need emotional or relational healing. Yeah, you can go to the doctor and, very, very much straightforward. And, like I went to the doctor, I had some GI stuff going on, and everything's good, thank God. But then I come back home to the same unresolved, relational stuff. Or I come back home to something that has been festering for years and I haven't dealt with it. So it doesn't matter what the physical condition is. You can be cured from that, but you still have these unresolved relationships that, are still not handled. So obviously, right, that's a very easy example, right? You can be medically cured, but you still have this psychological and these emotional unresolved issues going on. And the reverse is true. You can have worked through the psychological pain, the emotional pain, but you have a condition that is incurable. Maybe you're diabetic. That's not curable. That's a lifetime thing. If and you can manage that, right, with your diet, exercise, medication, if that's something that you have to do, right? So you can see then how that is, you're healed from that, but you're not cured from that physical condition. And recovery, may describe, a movement, right, towards functioning. And that's the thing, what's recovery? Recovery is, it's like, I can use my daughter's example. She tore her ACL, her meniscus playing soccer. So she had a physical condition. She had to have surgery. She was down for like a long time, I think like 12 or 13 weeks. And so moving towards recovery, when she was past that critical stage of the healing portion, moving towards recovery, then she had to decide that, hey, I'm going to go through physical therapy. Now that is tough. After that kind of surgery, that is tough. But moving towards recovery then, it simply means that, you're moving towards functioning. You may not go back to fully how you were, remember that, right? Because for her to go back to where she was, I mean, she's young, right? So she still has, full range of motion and doing different things, but she's still not able to play soccer this year. She probably won't play soccer until probably the end of the year, beginning of next year. So she did not fully go back to that, and she really won't. When we look at the scans, they had to, graft some parts of her knee to put it there, and yes, it will grow, but will it grow the same? Probably not, because there's been impact to that area. But recovery, right, is being able to make movements, to make changes, to adjust, to make the adjustment. And that's what healing is. It's making this adjustment. But once again, is your culture working for you, or are you working for your culture? Will your culture allow you to make the adjustments that's needed? So this recovery portion is really important. So healing does not always mean the wound disappears. Like her wound in there, in that knee, we'll see it. We'll see it. But the recovery piece is this conscious decision towards, functioning and examining, your culture. And remember, culture has to do with this ingrained way of belief. And our belief system is formed between the ages of 5 and 7. So we, between that stage of development, that wishful thinking, that fantasy, symbolism, all of that, it doesn't go away. It just gets formed. Now it gets hardened in a certain way. Okay? And so culture then is a big part of that. Maybe I'll do another series on that another time. So the way how we have one ego, which is that reasoning part of our brain, but the way how this reasoning part of our brain gets formed is based on the cultures and the different cultures that we are raised in. So how are you raised to think about, for example, death? How you are raised to think about grief? How are you raised to think about pain? How are you raised to think about emotions? Are you allowed to show them? But if we're talking about driving towards healing, which is our topic, we have to look at how you're doing this. How you're doing this. Like, how well do you feel? How do you feel about your life? So healing involves movement towards functioning. Again, functioning that is healthy, that is wholesome, and that brings you a certain quality of life and living. Your physical and your emotional wellness. Healing also involves a sense of self-direction, what you want for yourself, as I alluded to earlier, and purpose. And healing may be broader. It's personal, but it's more than personal, because healing also impacts those who are around us, like maybe your children, because they're listening and they're paying attention, they're watching, they're also being raised. And I don't like to use this word, but I'll use it just to make a point. Metaphorically, they're also being programmed to learn how to deal with their own pain and adversities that they will encounter in life when you're no longer here. And so what are we teaching them? Okay, so let's pause here. So, again, think about your culture, where you're from, where you're listening right now from in the world, and, honestly, how you were raised. We throw this word culture around a lot. And I think sometimes as a result of doing so, we lose the true meaning of it. And if we lose the meaning, then we also we forget about the impacts that it can have. So then, let's transition. Already 27 minutes in. If healing involves meaning making, it involves identity. If it involves relationships, I've spent a lot of time talking about that, or even hinting to it. Community and spirituality. Then the culture that shaped us may also influence what we believe healing should look like. I mean, seriously, for me, healing really has to include my spirituality. But once again, as I've talked about many times, even in the 7-week series, if your spirituality is somehow muddied up, if it's contaminated, then that won't be helpful to you. So that's an area that perhaps will need recovery. It will need recovery. It will need recovery. It will need to be addressed. Because remember, is your culture working for you, or are you working for your culture? Okay. So, from a cultural perspective, where I'm from, we don't really talk about feelings and emotions. In fact, very stoic background. I didn't grow up seeing my relatives hug. I did not. And by now you know that I had father absence in my life. So I didn't grow up getting hugs from a father, per se. I did not. So culture can influence whether healing is private or communal. And, in my culture, healing is very private. Nobody talks about their physical illness. We just don't. If anybody has cancer, and they died, you hear about it years later. Oh, Mr. So-and-so had this, or Mr. So-and-so had, oh, really? Yeah, we didn't even know that. Or even within your own family. I had a friend, few years ago, she ended up having breast cancer. And the type of breast cancer she had, she found out later on that her family's medical history, which she did not know, her aunts had that same cancer, and no one told her about it. And she was furious about that. I'd be furious too. So, in our culture, a lot of Latin Caribbean cultures, we don't talk about illnesses, whether it's physical or psychological. We keep that to ourselves. So in your culture, is healing, again, is it private, or is it like something you guys talk about? Is it communal? And again, culture can shape whether strength means speaking, right? For some of us, remember, some of us speak when you're spoken to, answer when you're called. You can't speak up. So lots of that, any psychological pain or emotional pain, you got to keep that. You can't even talk about that, right? Now, is your culture working for you, or are you working for your culture? And so culture can shape whether, whether strength means speaking up, whether it means enduring by yourself, like, being strong, praying by yourself. Or does it mean, for some cultures, is it okay to seek therapy, right? and is it okay to seek therapy and while invoke your spirituality too? Some cultures say, no, you can't do both. I've worked with women that says, no, it's a sin for me to seek therapy. It's a sin to seek therapy. And then also in that communal setting, it's not okay to even talk about what you're really experiencing. So is your culture working for you, or are you working for your culture? Also, family systems, right? The family rules, spoken or unspoken. Let me just tell you, because there are family rules that you just know certain things you just don't say or do. It's not explicit, right? But you just know over time, you just don't do that. So as a result, then, family rules will dictate, what stays private, what we talk about, and, and who's allowed to help. That's another thing. Oh my, the rank and file in Caribbean families is severe. If it's not an educated aunt or Dr. So-and-so, well, only those persons are allowed to give advice or even tell you, anything. It can't be someone who's low on the totem pole that can, speak a word of encouragement or give advice. Like, you're just not allowed to do that. So once again, is your culture working for you, or are you working for your culture? Is it? I mean, it's a touchy topic, but it's a very important one. And, we live in some really difficult times. And this topic, again, really just massaging in examples of my own, of others, to bring some normalcy to all of us, to understand that healing is not something that, we, what's what I'm looking for, that we can just customize by others. It has to be customized to where you are, what your needs are, and it needs to be customized for you, not customized based on other people, but it needs to be customized for you. In social work, we have this philosophy that we meet our client where the client is. Where are you now? Not where you were yesterday or 10 years ago. Where are you now? And, as clinicians, clinical social workers, we believe in that. We really do. You meet the client where the client is right now. Right? So you customize it, what's happening right now. What are you experiencing? What do you need? And oftentimes, I'm being clear, very direct, sometimes our culture really does not meet us where we are. It doesn't. And there's some parts of our culture that actually meets us too. So just to have a balanced perspective. For example, as I use myself often, our spiritual or our religious frameworks may give suffering meaning. And for me, it does. I gotta tell you. Right? It does. I think about the life of Jesus Christ and the sufferings that he sustained on this earth. And when things don't go the way that I like or prefer, and I tell him about it, some way or another, he softens my heart to say, hey, that allows you to align with my suffering. And what suffering does, it produces a different type of hope. A different type of hope. When I'm disappointed about, gee, I pray for this and I pray for that thing. And I'll be honest, because I journal a lot, I look back on the things I was fussing with God about. And yes, the pain doesn't sting as much. But when I look back, I can see his provision in there. And I can see some meaning in there. Not answers, I want to be clear. I can see the meaning after. I can see the provision. And I can also see the restoration too. We talked about how healing, universal, different definitions of healing. And healing also includes restoration. And this restoration is on a psychological and emotional level. So, spiritual or religious frameworks may give suffering meaning. And again, just using myself as an example, it does. Perhaps it's a particular, practice. Some people use that word ritual. I don't like that word so much because it gives off so many different meanings and may not be the one that I want. But it, for example, prayer for me, reading my Bible, physical exercise, integrating the mind and the body, movement, all of these ways of being, produces hope and creates a pathway forward for my own understanding, for my own meaning making, and perhaps forgiveness for myself. And so the cultural turn is what I'm calling this piece of our segment then, is to take a look at, is your culture working for you or are you working for your culture? This is the part that we need to take a look at. And now is a good time for me to introduce our poetry reading for today. And I'm going to do both today, actually. I'm going to read, and this is so culturally based, right? It's called Intro to My Freedom. My Freedom. I'll read the story because by now, Healing Up to Heart Lessons from My Journey is structured in such a way that it's, the reading, the story, and of course, then, you have the poetry piece. And I think this is a good example to show how stories bring to life, healing, my own personal healing, healing as a collective, healing through, family, community, healing through endurance, healing through the decision to take a look at whether culture is working for you or you're working for your culture. So now I'm going to read the story. So, and again, let me see if this one is just me. Again, it's just, some of the stories are a reflection of myself and others, but this one is 100% on me. After meditating on this particular day, by the way, again, it's called Intro to Freedom. After meditating on this particular day, I decided to bake a cake using a recipe from a cooking channel. The same day, I replaced my skincare product and bought a red lipstick. I was feeling my own power finally. When you've heard for a long time, if you wear makeup and lipstick, you will go to hell. Or if you wear pants, you will go to hell. Or gal, nobody now go want you. You have to learn how to cook. You won't get no good husband. Translation, girl, nobody will want you if you don't learn how to cook. To this day, I do not enjoy cooking as much. I am usually uncertain about myself in the kitchen. I still have to consciously guard my mind against the old narratives allowed to take root in my mind others had planted. I still don't wear makeup, per se. Yep, I do not. Well, now, I just use what I like, lip gloss, which you can probably see, mostly, and the red lipstick to challenge my old way of thinking. I have now learned and understood that there's no correlation with hell and makeup. Because on this instance, let me just pause here. Was my culture working for my identity, or was I working for my culture? So again, in this instance, it's a good example about how culture affected my identity in terms of cooking and being a woman. However, for a long time, this ill-conceived mindset contributed to the creation of a persona which really wasn't me. For example, at times I pretended to be able to cook authentic Jamaican meals only to be embarrassed. I don't like cooking. I literally held my nose up at others while yearning to be able to explore other interests and ideas. So you see, cultural ways of being can actually make us mask while looking down at others while we're actually really feeling that bad about ourselves. And you can really, relate this to or parallel this to your own grief, to your own loss, that you're masking something, looking down at others for grieving or hurting a certain way if they express themselves, when deep in your heart you wish you can do the same. And you can put this idea to other situations. Making matters worse, pause. I literally held my nose up at others while yearning to be able to explore other interests and ideas. Inside, I was caving in, plagued with secretly trying to measure up to others who were receiving praise and attention for their success. Making matters worse, I ignored my abilities, talents, and passions. And that, when I talk about, the cultural turn, how culture can shape if we keep things in private or is it communal? Are you allowed to speak up or not? You can see then how identity is woven into how we deal with grief, pain, losses, adversities, and just the hardships in our lives. You can see it here in the story. This became exhausting. Plato said it best. The first and best victory is to conquer self. To be conquered by self is of all things the most shameful and vile. I'm still trying to conquer self, the best and sweetest victory of all. This is my, my personal story. And, I'm going to pause here and go back to my notes for a little bit. So this was my personal story. And I can tell you about, of course, without divulging identities and personal information, that I've seen people that they have committed to their own healing, and they've done that through a collective. I've had women come, and their healing happens in a healthy way through church. I've had women say, hey, I went to my women's group. She said, this woman would say, after, we've talked about this, Keisha, I've gone through this and we've prepped for this. And, I can go on about that, different scenarios. And there's one person in the group I felt safe to say something to. And, that person, we just started having our own prayer time about the situation that I'm going through. And I've heard many stories like that. And that's a healthy way of healing. Now, I've seen situations too, wherein I've worked with women who say, I can't tell my family that I'm going through this with my son or my daughter. It's so embarrassing, and some people say, plus they have their own problems too. Who's going to listen to me? Do you feel like that sometimes? And then, so while we're carrying that, most women today, we have to work. She goes back to work, caring for others, and, really talk about what happens, but only when they're on the couch talking to me. And I got to tell you, if you're one of those persons, then that your healing, your recovery is going to take longer. And perhaps as you heal, you'll have that recovery, but you'll not have the full benefit of perhaps being able to express yourself the way that you want to. And maybe, maybe your family and, it's not the place, but where else can you go with that? Can you cultivate another way? Can you explore another way of this cultural, perhaps, approach? And this is why it's so important, right? Because I do like a cultural profile inventory of persons, and I say, hey, let's take a look at how this is, or who gets to say this, or who gets to do that, who has authority here, who doesn't. These are good questions to ask. And again, lastly, if you're from a Latin Caribbean background and perhaps other backgrounds, sometimes women grow up in two different worlds where, they come from a family where emotional struggles are rarely discussed. I mentioned that about myself, right? But later on enters a space where, therapy, appropriate boundaries, and naming emotions are encouraged. And I can tell you that I experience it a lot with the women and girls that I work with. And that's why I love what I do so much. Because, I've had women say to me, I can't say that to my mom. Oh my God. I could never do that. Literally. I've heard that. This has been, man, I have so much more that I want to say. I do. But it's 11:47. And yes, I am pre-recording today. because it's my anniversary. But I want to close and wind down with what happens when our healing language changes faster than our family or than our church or whatever your context is, your community. And sometimes that happens because then what happens is then, there's a disconnect. And then, that's a period of growth that you have to address. But I always ask, which is better? To continue to be saddled with what's not working for you, or to step out and be intentional about your growth in terms of your healing? Because healing is for you. It is. It is meant for you. It is. All right. So I'm going to close out with this poetry. It's called My Freedom. I think it's appropriate. It's on page 47 of Healing of the Heart Lessons from My Journey. Learning to be free. Seeing in my mind's eye freedom. Recognizing the power therein and boundless opportunities to win. Learning to be free. Christ has so much more for me. The world denied and mocked him. Yet even in death, he set captives free. Learning to be free means doing the ordinary and mundane with simplicity and creativity, knowing his grace has set me free. Learning to be free, so go ahead and wear that red lipstick. See yourself where you want to be, knowing the Creator anchors me. Go where you've never been, risk the unforbidden thing. Accept self and embrace imagination. I am off the reservation. Yes, I am free. I appreciate you so much, and thank you for listening. And I appreciate us speaking and talking together. And I look forward to week 7, where we will talk about resilience. I think it's so appropriate, flowing from all the previous weeks. We're going to end on resilience. And I think it's an important one to end on. Thank you again, and I look forward to us spending time together next week on Healing Reflections with Keisha. Thanks, guys. Bye.